2009, the rent control law was passed, regulating rents nationwide and therefore ensuring affordable housing. The law was aimed to help poor families from acquiring more expenses, as a big bulk of their monthly income are spent on paying rent. A study conducted by the Statistical Research and Training Center under the National Economic Development Authority found that around 1.5 million households out of 21.5 million households nationwide are families and individuals that rent their homes. Of these renters, 97% pay rent of 10,000 pesos and below monthly. The law was set to expire on December 2013, but it was extended to December of 2015, when thousands were left homeless by the number of natural disasters that plagued the country in the last year. To understand the law, we need to ask the following questions. What is the rent control law? What does it cover and how does it protect renters? And is it possible to further extend the expiration of this law?
Good evening. You are watching Legal Help Desk on 9TV. This show is about making the law work for you by giving legal advice on topics that matter to you. I'm Attorney Karen Jimeno.
And I'm Attorney Rod Nepomuceno. Tonight, we'll discuss your legal rights according to the rent control law. What you need to know about the rent control law as a tenant or lessee and as a lessor or landlord.
Our guests for tonight are Attorney Alan Amazona and Attorney Jonathan Uy, Legal Manager and Officer of Cathay Land Incorporated, respectively.
Yeah.
Good evening,
Good
and
evening,
thank
sirs.
you for being with us,
Yeah.
gentlemen.
So, Attorney Alan and Attorney Jonathan.
Good evening, Rod, and good evening, Karen.
All right, so well, all of us are affected by this law to some extent. No? Some are either landowners who rent out or to lease out, and some are really renting out.
Yes, and
their
also
apartment, no?
because this does not only correspond to renting sa houses, but also for those who rent commercial spaces for livelihood, for instance. Does it cover renting parking lots?
Pursuant to the rent control law, it doesn't specifically mention about parking lots. So
unless
definitely,
you probably sleep on it.
yes.
Or
So
unless
basically,
siguro-
it's not covered.
Yeah. What
Yeah.
if it's part of your contract? Now, you have the house and then kasama dun, or apartment na rin-rent, kasama dun yung parking, kasama, naka-bulk na together.
Yes, it can cover, provided that
It falls
the
under the
principal, the principal object of the list is the dwelling itself,
Okay.
the
Okay,
residential
let's
unit itself.
let's start off. No, a lot of people are asking, and this is actually a basic question. No? People are asking, what's the difference between rent and lease? All right, maybe perhaps we can, if there is even a difference, because some of them are asking
Or
that.
they
no?
use it
Yeah.
interchangeably.
Or do you use it interchangeably? Yeah.
Well, basically, they are the same thing, leasing and renting. Although, sometimes it differs doon sa, sa period of or length of stay. When you speak of leasing, sometimes it often refers to a fixed term with a fixed terms. The lease, it's a lease with a fixed term, say, for 1 year. Unlike in renting, it can, let's say, it can mean 30 days, 1 week,
Usually
or 2 weeks.
doesn't involve a term,
usually.
no?
Oo.
Okay.
And oftentimes, when you speak of lease agreement, it covers with a written contract always. Unlike in renting, it can be written or oral. So it can be both.
Okay.
Okay. And what if, for instance, you intend really to enter into a lease contract, mahabang lease contract, like 2 years, and you fail to have a written contract for it? What's the status of that contract?
Come again? Ano?
Let's say it
You're
doesn't-
leasing.
Yeah.
So you
There's
want
no contract.
to lease. Oo.
There's no written contract.
Oo, pero wala kang written contract. So for instance, it's a 2-year lease for a house and lot. So what would be the effect on the parties if they fail to put it in writing?
So in the absence of a written agreement, rental or leasing agreement, kasi the standard rental agreements are usually month-to-month. So that's the standard. So in the absence of a written agreement, you'll go by that standard rental agreement. So it will fall on a month-to-month basis. So it's at the end of the 30th, the lease or rental contract expires.
And then if you continue staying, it just continues on.
Yes,
Okay.
because in rental agreement, usually, let's say month-to-month nga, no? Ano yon? It's self-renew automatically. Unless either the tenant or the landlord notifies that to vacate the area. So there should be notice. So kumbaga continuous yun until and unless the tenant or the landlord says, okay, vacate the area. That's it. Unlike in a fixed lease agreement, which is fixed for 1 year, you wait for 1 year. You cannot change that. You cannot break the agreement. Until 1 year, that's the time that you can either you can it should be specified also. It's not automatic, no, in lease agreement. Let's say for 1 year, it's not automatic that the lease contract is automatically renewed after the expiration of that 1 year.
It's not automatic.
Unless the contract itself specifies that it's automatically renewed.
So for the requirements, one, pagka more than 1 year or definitely if you intend to lease, kailangan in writing. Does it have to be
Actually,
notarized?
under the civil code, if it's a lease for more than 1 year, it has to be in writing. Pag hindi siya in writing, it's unenforceable. Meaning, pwedeng mag-renege yung lessor or lessee on the contract of lease, and you can't do anything about it. So, under the civil code, you have to put it in writing, and if you do, you're protected. You have, if one of the parties breach the lease contract, you can go to court and enforce your rights based on that lease contract.
Okay. What about annotating dun sa lease? Yung iba kasi require pa nila yung from the lessor na paki-annotate nga sa
Yes.
title. Is that necessary?
For the purposes of rent control law, it's not necessary. But ordinarily, under the civil code, it states that if you annotate it on the title, if you annotate the lease contract on the title, if, for example, the lessor sells the property, the vendee of the property cannot evict the lessee.
So in other words, kung yung nagpapa-rent or nagli-lease ng property, binenta niya eventually, he has still a right to sell the property. Except that pag naka-annotate yung lease nung nagre-rent or yung umuupa, then the new buyer is required to respect.
Yes,
Respect that.
that's right.
Now,
That's right.
can there be a lease relationship between a landlord and a tenant if there's no money involved? For example, I'm just letting you stay, and there's no for free. Maybe you're my friend. But is there a lease agreement so that it falls under the provisions of the civil code and perhaps the rent control law provisions? Do you think that this still applies? Or do you require at least 1 peso or 50 cents or whatever?
Well, if I may, applying the rent control law, it speaks there of a consideration from 1 peso to 10,000 pesos.
Okay.
If within Metro Manila.
So if
or
I'm
NCR.
paying 1 peso, that means the lease provisions are applicable, meaning there's a lease
Yes, there's a lease
relationship.
contract.
between
There
the
exists a lease relationship.
And therefore, the provisions of the civil code and the rent control law will apply.
Apply,
Yes.
correct.
Pero pag pinapagamit ng libre, I think ibang legal relationship
Iba
na
yun.
yun. I think
Probably.
it's what we would call maybe usufruct
Yes.
under
Pwede,
the right to use
Correct.
property without really giving anything in exchange. No?
Or other provisions of law will be applied like the civil code, probably.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
All right.
let's
Sige.
concentrate on the
Yeah.
rent control law. Ano ba talaga yung covered dito sa law na to, and what does this law provide?
Well, firstly, the rent control was enacted by the Congress to protect the lower class.
Why do you say lower class?
Lower class, because it is stated in the Declaration of Policy in the law itself that that the state should protect those who are
I guess less fortunate.
earning
or,
minimum
yeah,
wage
earning minimum, yeah.
or even less.
Or financially challenged.
So
yeah.
and to strengthen our construction industry and housing industry, and to protect also these underprivileged people, you have to set limits on the increases in rent. So under the Rent Control Act of 2009, from 1 peso to 10,000 pesos rent, if you're renting a residential unit or a condo, an apartment or house or even a lot, That's the limit, 1 peso to 10,000 pesos. In Metro Manila and highly urbanized cities, like Zamboanga, Baguio City, Cebu.
So up to 10,000.
Yes, up to 10,000. And all other areas, it's 1 peso to 5,000 pesos.
All right. So in other words, if you don't fall under
Yeah.
these parameters, you don't fall under the rent control law.
Yes, but you still fall under the general provisions of the Civil
Civil
Code
Code.
on lease.
All right, so let's talk about the rent control law. If you, let's say you do fall under that, what are the, I guess, pertinent provisions? What are specifically for, let's say, the tenant? What are his or her rights regarding perhaps maybe ejectment or other
increasing rent.
increasing of
Yeah.
rent? What are the pertinent provisions on that?
First is that, again, in addition, yung rent control law kasi sets a 7% cap raise on rent on residential units. So meaning, the tenant, the lessor rather, has no right to impose increase on rental rate on rents above 7% in 1 year per year, no?
Per year.
Yearly, oo. Yeah, you could the lessor can impose a series of rent increase, no, in a year, provided it will not exceed 7%.
7% as a total rent.
As
for
a
the
total
whole
rent
year.
for the whole year. So
So there can be multiple increases.
multiple
So
increases,
pwedeng
1%, 2%, 3%.
Basta kailangan.
But
In
the
total.
maximum is 7%. So that's the protection given to, yun nga, as Attorney Uy was saying, it seeks to protect those belonging to low-income earning group and their beneficiaries against exorbitant and unreasonable rental increases
Okay.
imposed
Sige.
by the lessor.
Well, thanks for clarifying that. At least now we know kung ano talaga yung coverage ng rent control law. And later we'll talk about other instances or other situations naman if the rent you're paying is more than 10,000 pesos. But for now, we'll have to take a break. So Legal Help Desk will return, so stay tuned.
Under the rent control law, there are certain things that landlords are not allowed to do to their tenants. For one, they're not allowed to increase the rent imposed on their tenants for a period of 1 year, provided that the residential unit is occupied by the same tenant. In the case of boarding houses, dormitories, and bed spaces offered to students, however, increase in rent shall only be allowed once per year. Second, the lessor cannot demand more than 1 month advance rent, nor can he demand more than 2 months deposit, which shall be kept in a bank under the lessor's account name during the whole duration of the contract. Third, landlords are not allowed to eject the renter from the residential unit on grounds that the leased unit has been sold or mortgaged to a third person. If the lessor or landlord is found guilty of committing any of these violations, he or she will be fined between 25 to 50,000 pesos or be imprisoned for 1 to 6 months. However, the law also lists provisions in favor of the landlord. The landlord can eject a tenant and repossess the leased property for the immediate use of his family or any immediate member of his family, provided that he has given the tenant a formal notice 3 months in advance. The landlord can also eject a tenant if there are necessary repairs needed to be done on the leased property. The ejected lessee can go back to the unit after, provided that he is given the first preference to lease the same unit. Lastly, the landlord can eject the tenant once the lease contract has expired.
You're still watching Legal Help Desk on 9TV with our guests, Attorney Alan Amazona and Attorney Jonathan Uy.
All right, so we were discussing earlier about the prohibition under the law, the rent control law, no? About increases. You said that you can have multiple increases within a period of 1 year as long as it doesn't go beyond 7%.
But there's an exception, no? Attorney Alan
Yeah.
and Attorney Jonathan.
Yeah.
If the lessee would be students,
Yes.
or ano pa yung mga exceptions? Kung that you can only increase the rent once for every year.
Yeah, with respect to dormitories being rented by a student, the lessor cannot impose, it can only impose an increase once lang. Let's say
regardless if it falls within the 7%.
Yes, let's say for a year nag-impose siya ng the lessor impose 4% lang. He can no longer impose additional, let's say 3% more within that year.
I see. Okay.
So sorry ka na lang doon.
So this is relevant to
you can impose another increase, additional increase next year.
When is it? I guess what's the time frame? Kasi when you say from 1 year, from the effectivity of the law or from the anniversary of the lease contract, where is the 1 year counted?
From the execution of the contract.
Execution of the contract.
So if you're in the business of renting dormitories to several students, it's per student na nag-rent sa'yo.
Yes.
So kunwari, you're renting from me, I can only increase, kunwari, I impose a 5% increase as to you, then I cannot change it for one whole year. But for him, kunwari kay Attorney Alan, nagparent din ako sa kanya, pero sa kanya in-increase ko ng 6%, I can still do that.
Yes.
So it's contract to contract.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
that's correct.
And then this law or this prohibition on increasing, it only applies to a tenant who remains the same. For example, if it's another tenant, let's say, or perhaps maybe the sub-lessee of that tenant took over. What are the situations?
The law speaks only when applies to the same lessee, no? So, but the law says the lessor is given the option to set a new rent.
Okay.
So, if it's a different lessee.
In a situation, for instance, if you have husband and wife renting a house, and then ang signatory yung husband, tapos may nangyari dun sa husband, if the husband dies, technically, siya yung lessee dun sa contract.
The wife now becomes
Can the lessor then say that, I'm increasing the rent, we have to execute a new lease contract if you want to renew, pero mas mataas na yung rent nyo? Would that be possible?
No. You mean, no. The lessor cannot impose that because yung immediate, the law use the word, what's this? Immediate family includes husband and wife and direct ascendants and
Attorney Jonathan,
descendants.
is that correct?
Well, if you take a look at the law kasi, it's, and the whole family code, husband and wife thing, no? As much as possible, the law sees a husband and wife as one party. So if the husband rents or enters into a contract of lease for both of them, and the husband dies, that same contract should be applicable to the wife because they're treated as one.
In other words, the wife can use that as a defense.
Yes, I would say that.
You would
Yes.
say
Although
that.
the law
I would say
is
that.
not clear
Yes.
to say that it automatically applies.
Applies,
It's
correct.
still a gray
Not the same
area.
tenant, no? So
Okay.
I guess it's.
Pero I
it's not
guess if you're brothers and sisters, that same argument cannot apply.
No,
So
of
for
course
instance, if Rod and I were brothers and sisters and we were renting the same apartment and then something happens to Rod or he decides to move to the US, for instance, I can't say that, well, I'm the sister and I'm also staying in the same apartment. Pero kung hindi ako yung nakapirma dun sa lease contract,
That's a
then the
different.
lessor can increase.
Yeah, that's correct. Just to emphasize, no, kasi it's relatively important also to state in the contract, no, in the lease contract or rental agreement, yung persons who will use or occupy the premises. Kasi you will have, kasi later on kasi may mga situation kasi na ang landlord kausap, let's say, a brother only or a sister.
Yeah.
Or couples.
Yeah.
Then later on, may kasama palang later on, the lessor would know na may kasama palang mga anak na may pamilya rin yung anak. So
That's really going beyond
that's
the terms of
going
the
beyond
lease
the terms of the lessor.
Wala nang defense yung tenant nun.
Wala. Oo.
Yeah.
Kaya
Okay.
it's very important to specify that in the lease agreement.
All right. So we have some questions. I hope you don't mind, Attorney Alan, Attorney Jonathan. We have some questions from our viewers. Albert is asking, we are renting an apartment for 3 years for 5,000 pesos monthly. The landlord wants to increase the rent to 5,500 pesos. Can we refuse this given what is stated in the law regarding rent increase? What if the landlord threatens to evict us if we refuse. He didn't say if they're in the National Capital
NCR,
Region
yes.
or ano. But let's assume they're in the province. Kasi 5,000 pesos ang minention niya. So can the landlord do that? Increase it by 500 pesos?
Well, 500 pesos increase is more than 7%.
Yeah.
I think 7% of 5,000 is 350 pesos. So that would be exactly the case or scenario contemplated under
Kahit
the
na 3 years, he didn't increase it. Let's say 3 years,
Yes.
he didn't increase it.
Yes.
Okay,
It
all
doesn't
right.
matter.
Doesn't
because
matter.
It's a year-to-year contract.
I see. All right.
And the application of DOL is from year to year. So, for example, in the case cited, the landlord threatened to evict the tenant, right? What the tenant can do is, firstly, report it to the barangay, and because under our laws today, we cannot just file a case against the landlord if and only if the landlord and the tenant lives in the same municipality, or, for example, they live in different municipalities but the barangays are adjacent to each other. So if that's the case, if it falls under the current Katarungan Pambarangay law, you have to report it to barangay before you file a case that the landlord is actually threatening to evict you. And if the landlord pushes through with your eviction, you can file a criminal. It's also entails a criminal penalty for the landlord to do that.
And you're saying it's a criminal
Yes.
action? It's, under special law?
Yes, it's a special law, and it has a criminal penalty attached to it.
Yeah, you can go to prison for
Wow,
it.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
mga landlords dyan, you have to be
You have
careful.
to be careful.
Penal na eh. Penal in
Yes.
character.
Yeah, remember, 7% is the magic number. Okay.
We have another question from Roger. We are renting an apartment in Laguna, so this is outside of Metro Manila, and we are paying 8,000 pesos for it. We've been living here for 5 years, but the unit desperately needs repairs. The caretaker told us that in order for the repairs to be done, we needed to vacate the unit and the amount of 2,000 pesos will be added to our rent. Is this covered by the rent control law?
So it's in Laguna,
It's
they're
in
already paying
Laguna.
8,000 pesos. So,
Apparently, it's
That's-
not.
that's not covered.
It's not covered.
therefore,
Will not
what
apply.
the landlord was saying can...
They have to
However-
comply with that. It depends
No,
dun sa
it
contract
depends
nila,
on the
no?
contract. As I was saying, if it's a written contract and there is a specific provision that in case of repair or maintenance, the lessee should vacate momentarily, for example, and comes back later on after the repair. In which case, the lessor has to uphold that agreement. So he cannot completely evict the lessee because they have the agreement to return after the repair.
But he can't just categorically say, oh, I need to repair it. Is there a... How can the landlord prove that there is a definite need to repair it, and therefore the tenant has to move out first? What kind of proof that he has to show that you really
It
have to...
should be obvious siguro
Yeah.
kung necessary
Yes,
repairs, right?
kailangan obvious yung apparent, very apparent yung repair.
Repair.
That
May
probably,
holes, ano?
yes, may
Ceiling.
sa ceiling, tumutulo ang pag umuulan during rainy days, tumutulo. That, kailangan kasi,
The reason I ask is because obviously the landlord can just make some excuse. Oh, there are rats
But
all
then
over,
again,
or,
he
you
has
know.
to follow their
Yeah.
contract. If the contract is for 1 year, he can't just
he can
suddenly
just, yes,
Yeah.
correct.
use that as an excuse and not allow them
Yes.
to
So he
use
cannot.
back.
You
Yeah.
uphold that written
And also
agreement.
the
Okay.
question here says, pwede ba silang i-charge ng additional 2,000 pesos just because nagkaroon ng repairs? The answer, I think, is no, because they would still have to follow their contract, right?
Yes,
the rent
correct.
is only 8,000 pesos, and it does not state in the
State.
lease contract that for any repairs, the lessor can increase the rent. Then they should not be allowed to basically compel the lessees to pay the additional 2,000
That's
pesos.
correct. That's correct.
Okay.
All right, we have another question from Brian. Brian asks, I signed a lease contract for 1 year. However, I just left the unit after 6 months of renting. What will happen to my security deposit? What if they get a new tenant 2 months after I left? What will happen to my lease agreement? Yeah. So it was a 1 year contract. He's only stayed for 6 months. And he's wondering now what happens to his deposit. So, anyway, Attorney Jonathan?
Well, firstly, we have to determine whether it falls under the Rent Control Act or Rent Control Law of 2009. If it's less than it's 10,000 or less, it falls under the Rent Control Act. If he stays there for 6 months and he hasn't paid for 2 months, well, the landlord cannot evict him yet. Because under the law, it states that you have to not pay for 3 months at least.
3 months.
3
Okay.
months.
3 months is the magic number
Yes.
under the rent control law.
Under the rent control law.
Right.
So, what's the other question again? On the on
Well,
the
he's
deposit?
wondering what happens to his security deposit.
Well, if he decides to terminate, pre-terminate the lease contract, usually it's under ordinary lease or under contracts or rent control law. The safety deposits are forfeited. Because
Okay.
usually that's the standard provision under lease contracts. That if you pre-terminate your contract, whatever you put in as safety deposit, it's forfeited in favor of the landlord.
So after 2 months, the landlord can lease it out again.
Well, not yet, because if it falls under the Rent Control Act,
Dapat 3 months.
it has to be 3
All
months.
right. Okay. All right.
Okay, thank you for helping us answer questions so far. And I think there will be more questions. But for now, we'll have to take a short break. Legal Help Desk will return after these messages. You're still tuned in to Legal Help Desk on 9TV with our guests, Attorney Alan Amazona and Attorney Jonathan Uy.
All right. So just to clarify again, no, does it require that the contract between the landlord and the tenant be written for it to fall under the rent control law? Is it required that it's a written contract for it to fall under the purview of the rent control law?
The law does not specifically says that it should be in writing.
Kasi there can be an agreement.
There
without
can be an
writing.
agreement without written agreement. So whether it's in written or oral, the same it will apply.
So kanina we've been talking about the rent control law and basically the limits are it only applies if the rent is not more than 10,000 pesos if this is within Metro Manila, and outside of Metro Manila, it should not be more than 5,000 pesos. But I think now ang hirap na maghanap ng ganyang klaseng rent, no? So if you are renting an apartment or a house that is more than 10,000 pesos per month, and your lessor is trying to increase the rent, is there any remedy for you to resist that if you were the one renting or if you're the lessee?
Kasi as we were discussing here, yung rent control law applies only to residential units wherein the rent ranges from 1 peso to 10,000 within NCR and 5,000 other areas. No? In that case kasi, deregulated. So,
Meaning talagang-
lease agreement outside the applicability of this law is deregulated.
Okay.
So, it's a
Yeah.
take it or leave it.
So if for
It-
instance,
it's
by
a-
contract, nag-expire na yung contract natin na every month 35,000 pesos lang. And then by the time i-renew na natin, you're saying, no, I'm going to charge rent of 45,000 pesos. Wala akong magagawa. It's
Yes.
either I look for a new
Correct.
place within my budget.
But you are not prevented from negotiating with the lessor, of course.
Yeah, which
that
is
is
usually the
your
case anyway.
that is your
I think Attorney
and so
Jonathan
course of
wants to say
action.
something.
Course of
I have something
action.
to add to that. For example, there's a contract of lease for, let's say, 20,000 pesos. And within that contract of lease, it says that if you wish to renew this contract, the lessor can ask for a 100% increase. For example, you did that way back a year ago. What the civil code gives us a remedy. If you signed it before, you can go to court and ask the court to adjust the new contract of lease. The civil code states that if the penalty or the interest or increase in a contract is unreasonable and unconscionable, you can ask for a remedy for that from court. So that's what you can do. But as it is, pwedeng hindi na kayo mag-aayos, di ba? So maghanap ka na lang iba, like Attorney Amazona said.
Now, let's say if I'm renting something, and it's within the scope, no? Let's say it's 6,000 pesos. And I'm renting, let's say, a residential house, but I mainly use it as my bodega. I don't really stay there. Does that still fall under the rent control law?
Under the rent control law, it's not. It's not covered by it's not covered by these provisions. It states that the principal purpose of renting or leasing the property should be for dwelling. So that's what. That's
Okay,
what,
so even if my boy, for example, stays there in the bodega,
So kailangan talaga for residential.
for residential talaga.
of the one who's
Yes,
paying
of the one
Yeah.
who's
paying the rent,
leasing or
leasing,
renting
alright.
the property.
Okay, okay. All right, that's good.
Yeah, right now.
Okay, right now we have a caller on the line. Good evening. I think our caller's name is Victor. Victor?
Magandang gabi po.
Magandang gabi, Victor. What is your question? How can we help you?
Attorney, kami po yung mga matagal na po kami sa renta, no? We've been here for about more than 18 years, no? Since my parents, yung gano'n po. And we don't have any other contracts, no? Mababa lang po yung rental namin. But we do it yung sa mutual agreement every year. Minsan may increase, minsan walang increase, but it's okay with us, no? Then one day po, we were asked, yung lupa daw gagamitin na, at we asked for a kahit man lang po mga 3 months to 6 months. Pero ang ginawa po sa amin ay we were immediately sent a letter na yung bahay daw po inhabitable na. And then nagkaroon na po ng mga parang may pinadala ng parang team from the City of Manila for demolition. Nabigla kami kasi that's just after almost 2 weeks nung nag-usap kami nung aming landlord. Kami ho walang kontrata Kami ho ba yung mako-cover nitong itong loan na ito?
Victor, magkano yung binabayad ninyong rent? Tsaka saan yung rinirent ninyo? Nasa Metro Manila ba?
Nandito po sa Metro Manila.
Okay.
Tapos ang rental po lang namin dito nung unang-una ho, mga 600, 700. Pero ngayon po, nasa na po kami, mga 5,500.
Okay. Covered sila ng rent control law.
Pero wala ho kaming kontrata.
Okay lang daw. Okay lang
so,
yun. Wala
attorney,
silang
this is one of those instances na pinag-uusapan natin kanina na hindi naman kailangang may kontratang nakasulat. Diba? So, but kailan yung huling, ano ang magiging basehan nila to determine yung 1 year? Tsaka na kung kailan sila hindi pwedeng paalisin.
Or valid ba yung mga excuses na binibigay sa kanila ng landlord na parang we have to...
Gagamitin na sa iba.
Parang yun ang pinaka-crucial doon yung ground or basis of evicting them Parang yun ang concern na gustong i-address Kasi parang if I'm not mistaken, he mentioned something about court. May mga people from
City of Manila. Na dumarating na i-demolish daw kasi
yes,
they'll put up a house yata, no? No, Victor, they'll put up a house, kamo?
A new building. Parang ganun.
A new building. So,
Okay.
it's a new building but it's not gonna be used by the immediate family of the landlord.
Kasi ang yung rent control law defines or enumerates basis or grounds to evict a lessee. Among others, like non-payment of rental for 3 months or arrears of 3 months. And another one is yung, I think ito yung gustong i-mention niya, no? Yung something about condemnation ng building. Okay. Pag merong court order of condemnation, it's one of the
But
ground to
parang
evict.
yung-
However,
Sa kanila, hindi private entity ba yung sinasabing gagamit o yung gobyerno daw ng Manila?
Hindi, yung may-ari po, private
Ay,
po.
private purpose. So walang condemnation.
Walang condemnation. It's a private...
Parang siya mismo
okay.
gusto niyang
It's not
tayuan daw ng building.
no. It's obviously it's not one of those ground mentioned under
As
the
an
rent
exception.
control as an exception. So he cannot.
He cannot just do it.
The tenant cannot simply do it.
The landlord cannot just
Cannot
evict.
them.
Oo. So Victor,
oo.
sana nakatulong sa iyo yung information na hindi kayo pwedeng paalisin. But yung kailan po pwede silang paalisin? I mean, kailan mako-consider na tapos na yung contract nila and that they can be evicted?
Yun nga, that's the problem Kasi as I mentioned earlier, the standard rental agreements talaga are month-to-month in the absence of a written agreement or a lease agreement for a fixed term, like 1 year. We must clarify first kung if they have a written agreement.
Wala
In the
lang.
absence of that, we have to go to the general principle of a month-to-month. So at the end of every 30 day, the lease contract expires.
So they can
be evicted on that basis, but not on the basis that not on the basis na ide-demolish yung building.
So, Victor,
Wrong yung ano niya.
yun yung problem lang dito would be, one, covered kayo ng rent control law. Maliwanag yun kahit wala kayong kasulatan. Pero dahil wala kayong kasulatan, ang parang term ng contract ninyo would be month to month. So, pag natapos na tong month na to, pwede nang tapusin yung contract of lease nyo, but hindi because gusto niya magpatayo ng building, but because ayaw niya nang i-renew yung contract.
Ganun po.
Okay. I hope
Salamat po.
I hope nakatulong yan, Victor. Thank you very much for calling.
Opo.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Okay, we have another question now from Facebook. Cameron posted, my roommates and I rented a condo in Makati. We only skipped a month in rent because one of our roommates forgot to deposit the rent to the landlord's bank account. One day, we all came home to see our apartment padlocked with all of our stuff inside. Can they do this? What can we do to at least get our personal items inside?
Okay, so walang nakalagay yung amount ng rent nila.
Oo, and they're in Makati.
So, they're in Makati, so
Pero itong, di ba yung pag-padlock, it's also prohibited, yung biglaan na lang ipapadlock.
Yeah, that's not allowed
That's not
actually.
allowed.
Medyo baka makasuhan ka pa ng criminal
So, possible
case
yan.
dyan. That's possible. Pag,
lalo na if it falls under the rent control law.
Yes, oo.
So,
the law does not allow that
Yeah.
specifically.
So Cameron,
yung
Cameron, if your rent falls within the amount, which is 10,000 and less, you can file a criminal case against your landlord. Right?
But
For
even
doing that.
then, even if they're not covered by the rent control law, meaning even if the rent is more than 10,000 pesos per month, that act of padlocking is not allowed
It's also
under
not
our
allowed.
law.
Yes.
That's
So you
correct.
can
More so.
complain against your lessor and you're entitled to get your personal items back.
Although ang matindi lang sa rent control law, criminal.
Criminal
Penal.
O pwede yung
Penal
pakulong
eh.
yung
Oo, pwede
lessor.
pakulong.
On
May
top of
kulong.
that, kung less than 10,000 pesos yung, kung pasok sa 10,000 or less yung rent ninyo. And also, even if nag-skip ng 1 month, I mean, hindi nabayaran agad, hindi pwedeng basta-basta ipadlock. They
Yes,
should have had
that's correct.
notice
Yes.
first.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So in that case, he can go to the barangay, di ba? He can go
So
to
in
the
this
barangay
case,
for
Cameron, yung lessor ninyo yung mali.
All right. So now we have a question from Inigo. Inigo is asking, our landlord is asking for a 30% increase in our rent if you want to renew for another term. Our contract specifically states that the increase should only be a maximum of 10% at the end of the term annually. He says that if we don't agree to the 30%, he will just ask us to leave after the term. Can he do that? Does the rent control law or clause in our contract offer us any real protection? Okay, so 30% obviously is not, but we don't know his rent, di ba?
Hindi natin alam
Kung
applicable
above, Inigo, if you're above 10,000 pesos a month, there's no rent control law.
Rent control law.
Yeah, so technically the landlord can do that.
Yes.
But even if they're covered by the rent control law, if you have an agreement in writing that allows, meaning you already agreed that you will increase the rent by 10% every year, ano mangyayari dun sa contract?
Well,
Sige.
it depends kung kailan in-execute yung lease contract. No? If it was executed before the enactment of the rent control law, it would be effective.
When was the enactment of the rent? 2009.
2009. So if, for example, the lease contract was executed in 2008, tapos yung period of lease is for 10 years, for example, so until 2018. And yung increment increases is 10%. Sabi ng law, this law is without prejudice to existing contracts. So effective pa rin yun, yung provisions on 10%. But if it's a new contract, if it was executed after the enactment of the rent control law, hanggang 7% lang talaga. Hindi mo pwede increase 8, 9, 10.
So,
But in this
2009.
question, assuming
In
that...
addition, yes. In addition, if I may add, in addition, you were saying na it's stated in the contract na the landlord can only increase 10% annually. Ang remedy dyan, however, the landlord refused to acknowledge or uphold that
Yes, this is
agreement.
exactly our question. No?
Yes.
Yung 30% yun hihingi, but even then, yung nasa contract only says 10%. So,
His remedy is to file for specific performance to enforce that written contract.
So,
para i-respect ng ng
Kasi he's reneging
he's reneging his obligation because
under the contract.
it's a contract, ang contract is a law between the parties Yan ang yan ang batas nyo. Kung ano yung pinag-usapan natin, irespeto natin, yan ang batas natin. Unless it is against law or morals, public policy.
So in this case, kahit na hindi sila covered by the rent control law, because they have a contract that
Yes.
says they can only increase by 10%, the lessor cannot suddenly, basically not respect the contract by charging an additional 20%, meaning 30% increase in the rent. So you have a remedy here. You have to file a complaint for specific performance.
And
So,
stay there.
stay there. He
Stay
cannot
there.
be evicted.
You cannot be forcibly evict from your premises.
All right.
Okay.
That's it. Very
Thank
good.
you so much. Very informative. And I can't believe na tapos na
Alright.
bigla. And
We already reached an hour? Well, I have so many questions
So,
pa.
thank you so much, Attorney Jonathan and Attorney Alan.
Is
Thank you
greeting
for...
allowed here?
May gusto kayo
Yeah,
You're gonna
actually,
greet someone?
incidentally, it's my daughter's birthday.
Oh,
okay,
okay.
sure.
Of course.
For
Yeah,
the first
like,
time, no?
for
First
the
time na
first
may
time,
papag-greets.
yeah.
Sure.
Maybe this is my lucky day. That I will be a guest here.
We'll allow you. We'll allow you.
So
It's
please
your daughter's
greet your
birthday.
daughter.
I'd like to greet my daughter, Marinela. She's celebrating her 17th birthday today.
Wow.
Wow.
Happy birthday to
Happy
her.
birthday.
Yes. And maybe she'll
Next
be a
year,
future
study
lawyer.
hard.
And next year, she can enter into contract of leases already.
Yes, of legal age.
Of legal age.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Attorney.
Thank you too.
Alan,
Thank
Attorney
you.
Jonathan. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Stay tuned. Legal Help Desk will be back. So after these reminders. Welcome back to Legal Help Desk on 9TV. And today we had a very relevant topic because
Yeah, I
everyone,
like that.
At some point of your life, you rent, diba?
Yeah, at some point, everyone rented, then, or either you rented or you own property and then you're leasing
But
it
I
out.
guess
Yeah.
some of our highlights, one, when we're talking about the rent control law, this was passed by Congress specifically to protect those low-income earners. That's why the cap is also very low, meaning the law only covers those who rent property or lease property if the rent is not more than 10,000 pesos within Metro Manila and not more than 5,000 pesos outside of Metro Manila. So basically what this law provides is that if you are covered by the rent control law, meaning you pay those types of rents, then the lessor cannot increase the rent by more than 7% in a given year.
Yeah, and it's important to know this because the rent control law has penal provisions, meaning it has imprisonment as a possible penalty. No? So if you, let's say, charge more than 7%, or let's say you evict someone without giving them the proper notice, or let's say you evict someone even if they just haven't paid for 2 months, for example, because the law does require the non-payment of rent for 3 months before you can actually evict someone, and if you don't have notice, those are, or if you're just taking over, let's say pinadlock mo yung lease premises, no? You can't do that, and basically you have to be careful as a landlord. You really have to consider the provisions of this law before you do such acts because you may end up going to jail and paying a hefty fine between 25,000 to 50,000 pesos.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And the rent control law only covers residential,
Yun.
meaning properties used for residential purposes. So not for commercial areas. If you are renting, even if it's below 10,000 pesos, but if it's for a commercial purpose and your lessor wants to increase the rent, then you would basically have to negotiate. But then for those outside of the rent control law, some of the basic things that we were talking about today would be if the contract already has expired and your lessor or ikaw naman yung nagpapa-rent, you want to increase the rent, then you can do so because it's not regulated, meaning it's up to you for the parties to negotiate. If you're the lessee and you find the price too high, then you would have to look for a new place to rent.
Okay.
And then other things to also remember would be, pag hindi pa expired yung contract, you would have to respect the contract. So if you put in the contract that for a period of 1 year, you cannot increase your rent by more than 10%, then you would have to respect that contract.
Okay. All right. So over the week, we have received some questions and comments from our viewers on topics that we have previously discussed. There's a guy named Moore. Moore is asking what will happen if all the other assets, such as land, bank deposits, or shares of stock, are not declared in the last will and testament. Can I bring them out and tell the court that they should be included in the probate proceeding? And so
Yes. The answer is yes, definitely more. Because even if there's a last will and testament, there would be what you call the testate proceedings. So one is, of course, they're going to prove the will and say that it's valid. The court will have to make a finding that the will is valid and that its provisions can be enforced. But other than that, part of the job of the court and also what you call the executor of the will would be to collate, meaning gagawan nila ng inventory, pagsasamahin muna lahat ng properties of the person who passed away, or what you call the testator. So, taking all of that into consideration, yung kahit na at the time na ginawa yung will, may mga certain properties na hindi nasama, lahat at the time of the death na kasama, yun yung i-divide according to the will, depending on kung sino yung mga entitled dun sa will na makakatanggap. And for those naman na hindi mentioned sa will, pag may matitira, kasama yung mga properties that were basically identified as owned by the person who passed away as those that will be divided.
of course, just like in any other case, the legitimes will have to be respected. When you're going to divide those, I guess you call them newly discovered properties, no? Newly discovered assets. And they have to be divided accordingly. And again, the provisions on legitim or for the compulsory heirs have to be respected. All right, the division of those new assets that were discovered should not impair the legitim. All right, our next recap. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Our next recap question excited si Ron.
Alright.
We have another question from
Okay.
Maridel. I am single and do not have any immediate relatives, parents, or children. What would happen to my properties when I die? Maridel is thinking ahead. Well, if you don't have any immediate family members or any descendants, even if they're pamangkins, wala talaga, then all your properties will go to the state.
Yeah. Ultimately, yun ang
Oo,
it all
so
goes to
mapupunta
the
siya
state.
sa bansa natin.
Parang na-tax ka. In a way, pupunta sa bansa natin. Yeah, that's
Yes.
correct. So it has, I guess it has to be that way. Kasi who else will
But
take care of
what Marinel, what you can do is that if you're really concerned na wala makakuha, and if you have like a foundation or a specific advocacy or a cause that you want to support, maybe that's what you can do is execute a will that will choose a beneficiary, whether it's a specific foundation nga or yun, basically several causes that you want to benefit.
Or you can name your will to us, me and Karen.
We're open to that.
All right. Now, Richard posted the same sentiment on Facebook. No, we're now reading some of the comments that we're receiving on social media. Richard said, a very informative topic on writ of habeas corpus and warrantless arrest. I learned something today. 2 thumbs up. All right. Thank you so much, Richard. All right. And lastly, Ju tweeted, I love your show, not only for it being informative, but it helps me answer properly in my law final exams.
How nice! Meron naman before ako nabasa sa Twitter who said, thank you, your show is a great bar review.
Bar review. Okay,
So I'm
perfect.
so happy for all
Especially-
those law students out there since malapit na ang bar
Malapit
exam.
ang bar, yeah.
Next week is already the last week of September. So following that, October is the bar exam month. So
And
good
it's-
luck to all
Yeah,
bar
it certainly helps also if your bar reviewer is Attorney Karen. All right. That is all the time that we have for tonight. We'd like to thank our viewers for sending in your questions and comments via our social media pages. I'm Attorney Nepomuceno.
And I'm Attorney Karen Jimeno. If you have any questions on our topic for tonight, you may post these on our Facebook and Twitter pages. Join us again next Monday as we discuss your legal rights. Good night. Atty Land Incorporated, respectively.
Yeah.
Good evening,
Good
and
evening,
thank you
sirs.
for being with us,
Yeah.
gentlemen.
So Attorney Alan and Attorney Jonathan.
Yeah. Good evening, Rod, and good evening, Karen.
All right. So well, all of us are affected by this law to some extent. No? Kasi some are either landowners who rent out or to lease out, and some are really renting out.
Yes, and
their
also
apartment, no?
because this does not only correspond to renting sa houses, but also for those who rent commercial spaces for livelihood, for instance. Does it cover renting parking lots?
Pursuant to the rent control law, it doesn't specifically mention about parking lots. So
unless
definitely,
you probably sleep on it.
yes.
Or
So
unless
basically,
siguro-
it's not covered.
Yeah. What
Yeah.
if it's part of your contract? Now, you have the house and then kasama dun, or apartment na rin-rent, kasama dun yung parking, kasama, naka-bulk na together.
Yes, it can cover, provided that
It falls
the
under the
the principal object of the lease is the dwelling itself,
Okay.
the
Okay,
residential unit itself.
let's start off. No, a lot of people are asking, and this is actually a basic question. No? People are asking, what's the difference between rent and lease? All right, maybe perhaps we can, if there is even a difference, because some of them are asking
Or
that.
they
no?
use it
Yeah.
interchangeably.
Or do you use it interchangeably? Yeah.
Well, basically, they are the same thing, leasing and renting. Although, sometimes it differs doon sa, sa period of or length of stay. When you speak of leasing, sometimes it often refers to a fixed term with a fixed terms. The lease, it's a lease with a fixed term, say, for 1 year. Unlike in renting, it can, let's say, it can mean 30 days, 1 week,
Usually
or 2 weeks.
doesn't involve a
usually.
term, no?
Oo.
Okay.
And oftentimes, pag when you speak of lease agreement, it covers with a written contract always. Unlike in renting, it can be written or oral. So it can be both.
Okay.
Okay. And what if, for instance, you intend really to enter into a lease contract?
Of 10,000 pesos and below monthly. The law was set to expire on December 2013, but it was extended to December of 2015, when thousands were left homeless by the number of natural disasters that plagued the country in the last year. To understand the law, we need to ask the following questions. What is the rent control law? What does it cover and how does it protect renters? And is it possible to further extend the expiration of this law?
Good evening. You're watching Legal Help Desk on 9TV. This show is about making the law work for you by giving legal advice on topics that matter to you. I'm Attorney Karen Jimeno.
And I'm Attorney Rod Nepomuceno. Tonight, we'll discuss your legal rights according to the rent control law. What you need to know about the rent control law as a tenant or lessee and as a lessor or landlord.
Our guests for tonight are Attorney Alan Amazona and Attorney Jonathan Uy, Legal Manager and Officer of mahabang lease contract, like 2 years, and you fail to have a written contract for it. What's the status of that contract?
Come again? Ano?
Let's say it
You're
doesn't-
leasing.
Yeah.
So you
There's
want
no contract.
to lease. Oo.
There's no written contract.
Oo, pero wala kang written contract. So for instance, it's a 2-year lease for a house and lot. So what would be the effect on the parties if they fail to put it in writing?
So in the absence of a written agreement, rental or leasing agreement, kasi the standard rental agreements are usually month-to-month. So that's the standard. So in the absence of a written agreement, you'll go by that standard rental agreement. So it will fall on a month-to-month basis. So it's at the end of the 30th, the lease or rental contract expires.
And And then if you continue staying, it
Yes.
just continues on.
Yes, oo.
Okay.
Because in rental agreement, usually, let's say month to month nga, no? Ano yon? It's self-renew automatic.
In 2009, the rent control law was passed, regulating rents nationwide and therefore ensuring affordable housing. The law was aimed to help poor families from acquiring more expenses as a big bulk of their monthly income are spent on paying rent. A study conducted by the Statistical Research and Training Center under the National Economic Development Authority found that around 1.5 million households out of 21.5 million households nationwide are families and individuals that rent their homes. Of these renters, 97% pay rent